After the fear of losing begins to dissolve, a deeper layer of fear may start to reveal itself, one that is not tied to specific objects, relationships, or situations. The fear of being nothing. This fear is more subtle, more abstract, and often more difficult to recognize, because it does not always appear as a clear thought. It can appear as a quiet discomfort, a sense of emptiness, a feeling of not being enough, or not being defined. For most of life, the mind has been constructing a sense of self through memory, roles, relationships, achievements, and beliefs. This construction provides a sense of existence. I am this. I am someone. I have a place. These definitions create a feeling of solidity, of being something. But when these structures begin to loosen, when identity is no longer strongly reinforced by attachment, memory, or becoming, something unfamiliar may begin to appear. A sense of absence, not physical, but psychological. The usual reference points are not as active. The usual narrative is not as strong. And in that absence, the mind may interpret what is happening as a loss of self, as a kind of void. And this is where fear can arise, because the mind is not accustomed to existing without definition, without identity, without something to hold on to as me. So it reacts. It tries to re-establish a sense of self. It creates new thoughts, new descriptions, new identifications, anything to avoid that sense of nothingness. But when attention remains steady, something begins to shift in understanding. What is being felt is not the absence of existence. It is the absence of the usual structure of identity. And these are not the same. The mind has equated being with being something, with having a definition, a role, a position. But is that necessary? Is existence dependent on definition? Or has the mind simply become used to identifying itself in order to feel real? This question begins to open a different perspective, because it suggests that what is being feared is not actual non-existence, but the absence of psychological structure. And in that absence, something entirely new may be present, something that cannot be defined, something that does not rely on identity to exist. But before that can be seen clearly, the fear itself must be understood, not avoided, not replaced, but observed as it is, without the need to escape from it. As the fear of being nothing begins to surface more clearly, another layer of misunderstanding reveals itself within the mind. The assumption that nothing means non-existence. This assumption is rarely questioned. It operates quietly in the background. For the mind, to be something means to be defined, to have qualities, to have a name, a story, a position with an experience. These elements create a sense of presence, a sense of I am. But when those elements are not active, when the narrative softens, when identity is not being reinforced, when thought is not constantly describing and defining, the mind encounters something unfamiliar. A space without definition. And it interprets that space as nothing. But in doing so, it also interprets it as absence, as emptiness in the negative sense, as if something has been removed, as if something is missing. This is where confusion begins, because the mind is trying to understand something that is not conceptual using concepts. It equates nothing with no thing. And from there, it jumps to the idea of non-existence. But what is actually being experienced in that moment? Is there truly an absence? Or is there simply no defined identity present? When attention looks directly, something subtle becomes clear. There is still awareness. There is still perception. There is still presence. What is absent is not existence. What is absent is the structure that defines existence in personal terms. The labels, the descriptions, the boundaries, the sense of I am this. Without those, the mind feels disoriented, because it no longer has a reference point. It cannot locate itself. It cannot describe itself. And so it calls that nothing. But this nothing is not empty in the way the mind assumes. It is open, unstructured, unlabeled. The mind, however, is conditioned to find security in structure. So when structure is not present, it reacts. It tries to define the undefinable, to bring back something familiar, something that can be recognized. Because recognition gives a sense of existence. But when attention remains with that openness, without rushing to define it, something begins to shift. The initial discomfort begins to soften. The sense of absence begins to change. Because it is no longer being interpreted. It is simply being experienced. And in that direct experience, something becomes clear. There is no lack, no void in the negative sense, only the absence of what was previously assumed to be necessary. And in that absence, something begins to reveal itself, not as an object, not as an identity, but as a presence that does not depend on being something in order to be.
When the mind no longer rushes to interpret the absence of identity, something very different begins to reveal itself in what was once called nothing. At first it seemed like a void, an emptiness to be avoided, a lack of something essential. But without interpretation, without labeling, without the immediate movement to define what is being experienced, that nothing begins to show a completely different quality. It is not empty in the sense of absence. It is empty of structure, empty of identity, empty of definition, but not empty of presence. In fact, what begins to stand out is that presence is still fully here, clear, open, unobstructed. There is awareness There is perception, there is a sense of being, but it is no longer tied to a form, no longer tied to a story, no longer tied to someone. This can feel unfamiliar at first because the mind has always linked being with being something, with having a shape, a role, a description. But here being is present without any of that. And in that, something profound becomes evident. Nothing is missing. The sense of lack was created by thought, by the assumption that identity is necessary for existence. But without that assumption, what remains is not lack. It is openness, a field in which everything appears and disappears, without being held, without being defined, without being owned. This nothing is not the absence of life. It is the absence of limitation. It is what remains when the boundaries created by thought are no longer active. And in that there is a kind of freedom that the mind cannot fully grasp, because it is not based on becoming, not based on gaining something, not based on reaching a state. It is what is already here when nothing is being added, when nothing is being held, when nothing is being projected. This changes the entire meaning of fear. The fear of being nothing dissolves, not because something has been gained, but because it becomes clear that nothing was never what the mind thought it was. It was never non-existence. It was never absence. It was simply the absence of illusion. And what remains in that absence is not emptiness. It is clarity. It is presence. It is something that does not need to be defined in order to be real. And in that, something becomes absolutely clear. There was never anything to fear, only something to see. And now it has been seen. Without distortion, without interpretation, as it is.